Today, we're discussing a topic that sits at the intersection of health education, reproductive and sex ed, and access to healthcare. Thank you, Diosa and Mala, for talking with me today to discuss this topic. And I would like to start this conversation by asking you, when you think about healthcare, we usually think about the services provided, but we rarely think about health education. And when it comes to sex ed, it usually is stigmatized. Even though our society may not seem to want to talk about it, how important do you think it is, and why did you begin to do the work you do? Did you notice any gaps in sex ed?
In thinking about the work that I do and that I do with Diosa, especially in podcasting around sex education and sexuality, namely our podcast, Señora Sex Ed, I think one of the driving forces behind that podcast is something that we have talked about on our flagship show, Locatora Radio, for 10 seasons now, is our Catholic school upbringing and that educational foundation in a parochial setting where the sex education was, at least in my school, sex ed was covered in religion class, and it was abstinence only and saving yourself for your husband and for Christ, and separate genders when there was some semblance of an educational sex talk. Fast forward after Catholic school, me personally, I worked at a rape crisis center, 3 years as a full-time employee, 1 year as a volunteer on the LA Rape and Battery Hotline. And in my work, it was because the topic is a violation of sex and it is assault utilizing sex, inevitably, we had some training on some basic aspects of sex education for our survivors, for our clients who maybe also didn't receive that basic information. And that lack of basic information about sex, sexuality, consent, the body, quite often figures its way into abusive and assaultive situations. So it prepared me to talk about consent, the body, and those like abusive red flags to look out for. So when I left that job, I started working as an actual sex educator, as a teacher in a school for girls in Pasadena, grades 4 through 12. And there was like an adaptive curriculum based on the grade level. And it's a non-religious school, and the sex education was extremely comprehensive and started at the middle school level and just built on itself as the years went on. So for me, that's part of my professional background and personal background, which is why I definitely think that the show came into our orbit, at least when it came to like imagining ideas for new shows. What types of shows could we possibly make? We came up with a long list of a diverse array of shows that cover all types of topics, and Señora Sex Ed figured its way in there.
Something that I love about Señora Sex Ed is that it's a 30-episode season, and we interviewed women of all ages, as young as 19, 20 years old to women in their 70s. And the overwhelming response from a lot of the women that we interviewed, I would say the majority, was that they never received any conversation from their mother, a relative, an elder about what their period was, really going into their first menstrual cycle with a lot of fear and trepidation and shame. There was this inherent correlation with having a menstrual cycle and being ashamed of it. And so we, very clearly saw that women of all ages, starting very young girls, were lacking very basic medical information about their bodies. And that really set the tone for the type of education that they were going to receive either at home or through school. And it was very basic, like reproductive. This is what happens if you have sex. But there was no conversation about pleasure, about consent, about healthy relationships. And I think those are the big gaps that we've seen in the experiences that our guests have shared with us in their relationship to sex education.
Amazing. I love that because there's so many gaps in the type of conversations that we're having. And with that, right, like as advocates for sexual education, what role does storytelling in media, such as your work, play in shifting these conversations around sexual and reproductive health? How can I help people, seek the healthcare they need? Because if we don't know the information of our bodies, just simply put, it's going to be really hard to even know what kind of healthcare we need when it comes to seeking those services.
I think about the way that storytelling has traditionally been utilized in like sex education as stories that are supposed to scare you away from having sex. It's like fear-based storytelling. So-and-so slept with these people and didn't use a condom. So-and-so has contracted all of these sexually transmitted illnesses and their life is ruined and they're going to die. Basically, there's all these like little tales that get passed on and we hear them over and over again. Even a phrase sort of like, basically discouraging young women from having sex before marriage. Why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free? Like that's such an old little like thing, that people say to young women, and it's anti-sex and it's anti-autonomy. And so storytelling has been used for evil, we'll say, in that regard. I even think about that one scene in Real Women Have Curves where the mom is like, Norma, her fiance convinced her to have sex with him the night before the wedding. He got a taste, didn't show up to the altar, left her, and that was her fault because she had sex with her fiance before they got married. And this is one type of an example. I know that at my brother's all boys Catholic school, that of course they did a classic slideshow with pictures of genitals that had not been treated for their STI, right, at very advanced stages. I think Diosa has a story about a lesson involving abortion. These stories can be gruesome. So we're doing it in a different way. We're utilizing storytelling, but as an opportunity for empowerment, for autonomy, for learning, for reclaiming. Maybe even in some cases, like in Aida Rodriguez, in her interview on Señora Sex Ed, she's talking about her sexual assault and being very open about it and very vulnerable and something that maybe she hadn't done story-wise on a show like this before. So that's how we've been utilizing the storytelling in Señora Sex Ed.
Yeah, and I think also for Señora Sex, our second to last episode of the season, we invited a woman from the California Latinas for Reproductive Justice. Her name is Virginia, and she shared her story about accessing abortion care as a teenager and then as someone later in life. And for us, that was so important to share that story because we may not think of abortion care as someone already in their 40s that's receiving an abortion. We may think of the young girl who maybe, quote, gets in trouble or has, quote, premarital sex. But we're not always thinking about the older woman who maybe needed to access an abortion because she just didn't want to start over. Mm-hmm. She maybe already has children. And so for us, I think Señora Sex Ed is so special and unique because we included the types of stories that we hadn't seen before, but that we knew existed in our community.
Yeah, this is so important to talk about because usually when it's stigmatized, we're also afraid to seek this care. We're like, we're kind of trying to not tell anybody that, we got a pap smear even, or we got an abortion, or, just even having the basics. Like I will share a little bit about how, HPV vaccine was so stigmatized when I was 12. And everybody, in the community was like, you do not want to get the HPV vaccine because it's going to make your daughters promiscuous. And my mom, she's a very Catholic lady, but she was always so informed about what to do and best for healthcare. and she took us to get that HPV vaccine. And I think if we had more conversations like what you are having with our community, people would have a better picture of those stories, of so many more things that encompass, our experiences as women, and also how to access care so we prevent cancer, so we prevent STIs, or treat them if, it happened, or getting birth control and abortion, stuff like this. And it's so important right now to talk about it too, because, our rights are under attack. And it's like, how do we protect ourselves and how to also still connect with the services that we need and amplify, right? All of these different experiences, from the trans community to young women to, older folks who sometimes we don't think about when we discuss these topics. Thank you so much for sharing that. I also want to talk a little bit about the intergenerational conversations, because you also have that a lot in your work. And those conversations about sex ed are often limited, with many Latinas learning about reproductive health on their own or even from friends. And I've heard a lot about that too. You're all talking about it. But, what role do you think family and society has played and plays in shaping access to these conversations, but also to the care, right? The healthcare that we get? And how can we encourage more open conversations?
I think it's interesting that it's quite often the very notion of family itself that conservatives utilize to prevent and halt and stall and squash our reproductive rights and services. And in the show, what is definitely revealed, I think, episode by episode, is that family is either where you're getting all your information to start, or where you're getting none of your information. And I think the show, episode by episode, sort of like is pushing back on itself, because you have guests who say, my mom didn't say anything to me, not to expect a period, not that it was going to happen, not that my body was going to change. Like some of the most, what we would consider to be the very basic, pieces of information about puberty and human development, physical and sexual. Plenty of our guests didn't get it at home, and then they didn't get it at school, or they got a limited version or a dated version. But then you also have our guests who are coming on with their moms, who have had very open educational relationships with their mothers, and their mothers brought them books and pamphlets and pregnant Barbie dolls, and answered questions and shared, and took an active role in the education of their children around these developmental topics. So family is so many things. It's like utilized as this weapon to prevent families from talking about making families. But it's also the place where you're most likely to get those first bits of information from a trusted source close to you.
Yeah. And I think just to add on that, I would say the majority of our guests shared that they did not receive any type of sex ed, any type of sexual health information from their families or even in school. And the ones that did receive it in school, it was very biology based, right? But we did have several guests, several women who either came on with their mothers or came on individually and talked about the very open conversations their mothers had with them at home from a very young age. And I think if anything, those episodes in particular are really great examples for anyone who's parenting, who's mothering in their own way, and wants to have those conversations with their children, their nieces and nephews. And I think that they're really wonderful possibility models that maybe we didn't have the information when we were growing up, but there are people now that are trying to change that stigma and break that cycle that Latinos, quote, don't talk about sex or don't have conversations about healthy relationships. And I think that those episodes in particular can be really great tools for teaching and for learning. And one in particular was actress Isabela Gomez, who is a Colombian American actress, and she talked about her parents being super open about sex and sexuality, and she was the quote sexpert of her friend group, and having all of the information actually pushed her to not have sex. And so I think it really does push back on this idea that if young people have too much information about sex, they're going to go crazy. They're going to be nymphos. They're going to want to have all the sex possible. But actually, for all of the guests that shared that they had accurate, comprehensive sexual education and all of the information, it actually led them to not want to have sex at a young age because they knew that they weren't ready to actually take that step. And so I think that the proof is in the pudding. They told us what was possible. And I think that it's a 30 episode season, and there's so much for anyone to go back and listen to.
Yeah, and it's so interesting that you say that, because studies in other countries that do have comprehensive sex ed show that they do wait when they know more information about this and they feel more ready. They don't feel that pressure. Sometimes we also have no talk about healthy relationships. And apart from that, we don't even have conversation about sex. So then you grew up thinking that, sex and love somehow, have to do with that. And as a teen, you feel so confused. And then you have a harder experience kind of thinking about all of this, even when you're an adult. And your friends and media, they have all of these types of scenarios. But I think one of the shows that I really liked, that I watched, that really gave a healthy outlook to this was Sex Education. It was a British show. And I really love this show because it gives you more of the idea of what sex ed could be. And I loved how they talked also about relationships and consent and so much so of diversity as well. So I really love to see shows like that, and also, listen to your podcast that talks about all this and destigmatizes these conversations. Because, the more you're talking about as well, the more informed people are about what it is that, they could expect, how to protect themselves when they're ready to do this as well. And now I want to get into a question about your experience, however comfortable you feel. Have you experienced any difficulty accessing reproductive and sexual health care? And with that, your experience with sex ed. So I just want to connect the dots here between, how you got whatever education you got, and then also how your healthcare experience was. We all know that it's hard to get healthcare as a teen. You have to have your parents most of the time. And we know that in California, when you're 12 years old, you can get access to sexual healthcare. But in your own experience, how, was it easy? Was it hard? Tell us about that.
Yeah, when I was in high school, so my high school was a non-denominational, non-religious high school, right? An independent school. And we had a class called Human Sexuality and Relationships, and you could take it. There's 2 levels. There's year 1 and year 2. And I took this class both years. I loved this class. And something I learned in this class is that you could go to Planned Parenthood and fill out the paperwork in a particular way as a young person and get your free services. And you sign up for the Family Pact program, and they give you a green card. And the whole process was one of our lessons 1 year. And so when I was ready to seek out reproductive health services, I think because you go to your pediatrician for ever, right? Until you're literally an adult, you have your pediatrician. And I'm not going to go to my pediatrician for my reproductive health needs as an older teen. A young adult, an older teen. So I had that information from school, and it was accurate and it was verifiable. And I'm in Southern California. So it, for me, allowed me to have all the tools and information I needed to book my appointment and go to Planned Parenthood when I was ready to start that journey. And I've gone to Planned Parenthood and got services in Massachusetts as an undergrad, again, as an older teen, as a grad student, as somebody who has had insurance, or I have insurance, but there's times that I didn't have insurance, and you're in those transitional periods, and for whatever reasons, but throughout all these different phases of my life, Planned Parenthood has been that very accessible, reliable resource. I've gone to, of course, I have my gynecologist, I have my primary care physician, those folks are there, but it seems like, at least in California and in Massachusetts, and the times in my life when I've needed Planned Parenthood, it's there. And we must protect Planned Parenthood at all costs.
Yeah, I second that. I think living in Los Angeles gives us a certain amount of privilege in terms of accessing reproductive care. When I was in high school, I did go to a Catholic high school, and I remember receiving a type of sex ed, and I want to say it was comprehensive in the sense that it was at a Catholic school. And I went to an all-girls school. And so there was definitely, I remember it was part of our health class. I don't remember the specifics, but what I can say is that it was very hetero. It was about sex between a man and a woman. And at that time in high school, I was exploring my sexuality. And so I did go to PlannedParenthood.com and I looked up safe sex for women with women. And that was one of the first times I accessed any type of sexual health education on my own. And I just did it through Google. I don't remember how I found Planned Parenthood as a teenager. I did not have a class like that where, like Mala did, where they were talking about Planned Parenthood and giving you like this assignment. Maybe I just Googled like safe sex for lesbians is probably what I'm thinking, but I don't remember exactly how I came across Planned Parenthood. Later in life, as a young woman in my 20s, I accessed Planned Parenthood multiple times for reproductive care. I also have accessed the local LGBT centers for free STI testing. I did that pretty regularly in my early 20s. And now, I still consider Planned Parenthood such an incredible resource that offers all kinds of healthcare, right? It's definitely, been painted as an abortion care provider, but it provides so much more than that. And it's essential. I'll never forget one of my first times visiting a Planned Parenthood as a young woman in her 20s. I remember being asked if I was in a safe relationship, if I had a healthy relationship, if I ever felt scared, or if I ever felt like I was in danger. And that is not something that you're asked by your gynecologist or your primary care physician for whatever reason, right? But these type of this holistic approach that I received at Planned Parenthood, I think is so important. And you can see just in that question alone why it's so important and why it goes beyond just reproductive care, but healthcare in general.
Right. And I think it's really important to think about when we think about healthcare justice, that we're talking about, how Latinas can also get that treatment that we need, because so many times, right, we've not had that treatment. We've been excluded from a lot of things, or we've also had terrible experiences with research studies and things like that. So to have a cultural approach to our healthcare is also going to be so important in these conversations. And I want to ask you a question, right? Because we talked about Planned Parenthood. I too have had amazing service by Planned Parenthood and just basic care, really. When my doctor couldn't see me, Planned Parenthood was there. Now, I also want to ask you, right, when it comes to access, it gets kind of complicated sometimes because sometimes we are asked insurance for our insurance. How would a single payer system have made a difference if you just could go into the doctor, not have to wear insurance, or even having to look up things? You would just go to any provider in your local community, because sometimes we also have in and out of networks. Most of the time, that's also part of the things I've experienced with my healthcare insurance. How easier would it have been if we had a universal healthcare system?
I want to jump in real quick and say that I have changed health insurances so much that I have not been able to actually build a rapport with a doctor. And I think that is one of the most important things when you want your symptoms to be believed. Right. You want anything that you're experiencing, you want to trust that this person is taking you seriously and is taking everything into account. I don't think you can do that in these 15-minute appointments where the doctor is brand new to you each time, right? Each time we have to change health insurances when it's tied to our jobs, we are not building a rapport. We're losing access to that physician. And as someone now thinking about if I want to have kids or not, I'm thinking long term, am I going to have a gynecologist that will be here for the next couple of years as I'm in my 30s? There was a gynecologist that I had in my late 20s who I really respected. She was so fantastic. And I fought to get her included in my insurance. I did all of that. And then she retired.
Oh, no.
And so happy for her, but sad for me. And so I think that when we do this like jumping around because our insurance is tied to our jobs, it really robs us of that trust that can be built when you have the same doctor or you have the access to jump around if actually that doctor is not for me.
I have a story about this that like stressed me out so much. Like years ago now, I've talked about this on the show. Years ago now, I had a Bartholin gland cyst. Diosa's heard about my cyst so many times. Like she knows so much about my cyst. It's horrible. And now you all will too. I woke up with a horrible Bartholin gland cyst and it got really big. And I was in Bakersfield visiting my family. But, you know, my insurance and my providers and everything were all in LA. So I drove the 2 hours from Bakersfield and it was a weekend. Things are closed, you know, and I can't just call up my primary care physician. I have to go to like urgent care. I have to go to the emergency room. I have to go somewhere where they could perform a procedure and drain this cyst. They had to drain the cyst. And so I'm driving. I can barely sit. It's the size of a golf ball.
Oh my God.
I cannot see my vulva. It's horrible. And I'm driving myself and I go to the designated urgent care that pertains to my insurance, good insurance from a private employer, like a PPO. But there was nobody in that day who could drain it for me. And that's the place that I'm supposed to go that's covered by my insurance, that's connected to my job. And so they're like, you have to go somewhere else, you know? And so I just go to the general, you know, just at an emergency room somewhere, you know, and to be seen. And eventually I was seen, but I kind of had to go to like 3 different places and drive 2 hours.
In pain.
And in pain to get this thing drained. And it was horrible. And it had so much to do with the insurance and who's open and who's available and all these things. And what was wild to me is at each place that I went, they said, oh, it's a really simple procedure and it's very common.
Wow.
So if it's so simple and it's so common, why can't you do it for me?
Because insurance. That's why.
Exactly.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
That is my story. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard because that is basically many times what stops us from really getting the care we need, right? It's like you have these great clinics that you could go to, but in an emergency, it's like, good luck, or you get a surprise bill. I got many of those. That was quite terrifying. Getting like thousands of dollars, and I'm like, how am I going to pay this? Something I didn't. I will be honest. But I want to close this up and just, you know, ask you, like, what is a highlight that you have had in the work that you do that you can share with us?
A really impactful episode that I think brought a really important lens into our sex and sex education conversation was an interview with Liam Winslet of Colectivo Intercultural Transgrediendo in New York City. This is a trans rights and resources and advocacy organization. We met Liam at the Asamblea Nacional, hosted by the National Day Laborers Organizing Network. We attended Liam's workshop, which was about sex work as work in Spanish for working class Latino jornaleros. And we found that really empowering and incredible and progressive. And we had Liam on the show, and Liam talked about the work that they do in New York. They talked about the struggles. They talked about, and she talked about her own personal relationship as a trans woman, immigrant woman, HIV positive, in love with a trans man, and the work that they do around their own relationship. So that is an interview that I really highly recommend, because I think it's a lens that most of us are not considering when we're thinking about sex, sexuality, autonomy, and labor.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I also want to ask you all, since you have so many amazing stories to tell, thank you so much for joining us today. But I want to know, tell people, where can they find you? Where can they know about your work?
You can listen to Locatora Radio, our flagship show, on any podcast streaming platform. We just launched season 10. And we just wrapped Señora Sex Ed a few weeks ago, and there's 30 episodes. It's one season. It's an incredible lineup of guests. And I think we gave a little tidbit, a little sneak peek of the amazing guests that we had on the show. And what I love about Señora Sex Ed is that the stories are there forever. You can go back and listen whenever you want. You can learn from these incredible señoras, señoritas, and really just enrich your life and share it with your mommy, your tia, your prima, because I guarantee that these conversations that we have on the show will spark a conversation in your own family.
Thank you so much to both of you. I have been listening to you for quite some time now, so it's such an honor to have you here with me today, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Jackie.